Hello and welcome to Spiritual Life Today with blah. Hello and welcome to Spiritual Life Today. My name is Phil Rose. I'm one of the chaplains here at Episcopal Homes. So during the months of September and October, we are reading a book called God and the Pandemic. It is by a former bishop in the UK and biblical scholar N.T. Wright. We have been going through it. We are now in chapter 4, and this chapter is about reading the New Testament. And he is asking the tough questions about where is God in the midst of this pandemic, and how do we understand what's happening with this pandemic and square that with our theology and our understanding of God and of Jesus. So we will pick up where we left off. So what are we saying? Not only do we, the followers of Jesus, not have any words to say, any great pronouncements on what this all means, to trumpet out to the world, of course, isn't waiting eagerly to hear from us anyway, but we, the followers of Jesus, find ourselves caught up in the groaning of creation, and we discover at the same time God the Spirit is groaning within us. That is our vocation, to be in prayer. Perhaps wordless prayer. At the point where the world is in pain. At those very moments when we find ourselves weeping with grief at the death of a friend or a family member, or at the impossibility of having a proper funeral, or at the horror of millions of the world's poorest being at risk, or simply being locked down, is inherently depressing. At those moments, when any words we try to say come out as sobs or tears, we have to remind ourselves that this is how God the Spirit is present, at the heart of the agony of creation. Yes, like Jesus himself being hailed as King of the Jews when he shared the agony of Israel and the world on the cross. The redefinition of control, of kingdom, of sovereignty, which we find in the rest of the New Testament, and particularly with Jesus himself, here reaches its true depth. To understand this strange phenomenon, God himself, God the Spirit, apparently unable to manage words, but only groans. Paul reaches back to that great psalm of lament, Psalm 44. God is the one who searches the hearts and knows exactly what's going on there. When our hearts are groaning, within the groaning of all creation, the God who searches the hearts, the Father, in other words, knows the mind of the Spirit, as some translations put it. He knows what the Spirit is thinking. Here is the mystery. God the Father knows the Spirit's mind, but the mind that the Father thereby knows is the mind that doesn't know what to say. Dare we then say that God the Creator, facing his world in meltdown, is himself in tears, even though he remains the God of ultimate providence? That would be John's answer, if the story of Jesus at Lazarus' tomb is anything to go by. Might we then say that God the Creator, whose word brought all things into being and pronounced it very good, has no appropriate words to say to the misery when creation is out of joint? Paul's answer from this present passage seems to point in that direction. The danger with speaking confident words into a world out of joint is that we fit the words to the distortion and so speak distorted words, all to protect a vision of divinity who cannot be other than in control all of the time. At this point, of course, someone might quote the text verse Romans 8:28, has often been translated something like, all things work together for good to those who love God. That is the line taken by the King James Version. The NRSV and the ESV, the English Standard Version, the first marginal option in the NIV, and others. That is what many Christians were brought up to believe, making people think that they ought to be able to say of any and every disaster that in some way it was for the best. Many who have understood it like that, and who have found, let's be clear, a kind of comfort in it, have effectively skipped over the previous verses. They seem rather strange, but God will work it all out. That has then sometimes cast as an almost stoic blanket over everything bad that happens. Never mind, all things work together for good. Is that really Christian comfort? Is that kind of passive acceptance really what the verses we have been studying seem to be advocating? Is that the appropriate response to the corona disaster? I don't think it is. I have been helped here by certain recent scholars who have argued strongly for an alternative approach which, though occasionally suggested, has never been widely accepted. Their solutions are simple, but not identical. To the proposal of Robert Jewett in Romans, the way forward is to challenge two regular assumptions about the sentence. First, is all things really the subject of the sentence? Is Paul telling us in this most God-oriented of chapters that all things have a kind of internal energy and operation by themselves? No. It is in fact far more likely that God is the subject. Some early manuscripts added ho theos, God, to make this clear. God is, after all, the subject of the previous verses, albeit referred to as the searcher of hearts. The Spirit is the subject of the second clause in verse 27, because the Spirit pleads for God's people according to God's will. But this point is subordinate to the main sentence, where the main subject is the heart searcher, God himself. It is easiest to assume that this carries on into verse 28. In verse 28 itself, God is twice referred to as He, those who love Him, and according to His purpose, which implies that He is already present in the sentence construction. This is getting very precise and detailed, but I think he's making a really important point here. God is then clearly the subject of verse 29 and 30, which follows on immediately. Some, however, have argued that the Spirit, the subject of verse 26, and mentioned in the second half of verse 27, is the real subject, rather than all things or God. Most scholars, however, have thought this less likely. Second, and even more important, why are we so sure that verse 28 speaks of God working all things for the benefit of those who love Him? That is the normal reading offered by the King James and others, and as we have seen, it can be made to fit either with all things working together for good, or with God, who is working all things together for good, or indeed with the Spirit as subject. The King James Version, taking all things as the subject, renders it all things work together for good to them that love God. The NIV main text paraphrases taking God as the subject and making those who love Him the beneficiaries. In all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. I have followed this line in my own translation, the New Testament for everyone, the Kingdom New Testament. God works all things together for good to those who love Him. The problem with this is that the verb doesn't mean to work for the benefit of. It means to work with. The word here isn't the normal word for work. It is work together. The sin at the start means together, or with the erg bit means work. Paul uses the word on two other occasions. In 1 Corinthians 16:16, he's talking about the fellow workers who collaborate with him and with the whole church. In 2 Corinthians 6:1, he sums up the previous passage about God working through the apostles, like a monarch acting through his ambassadors, but saying that he is working together with God. This would imply that if Paul is talking here about God being at work, he is saying that God is working with people, doing what God wants to do in the world, not all by himself, but through human agency. This is, of course, normal in biblical theology, looking back to the image-bearing vocation of humans in Genesis 1 and in Psalm 8. The cognate vowel, synergos, is more common than the verb. Paul uses it 11 times to refer to his colleagues, people who work with him. Once he uses it to say that we, the apostles, are God's colleagues, working with him. That seems to be the point here. God works all things together. I blew it. That seems to be the point here. God works all things towards ultimate good with and through those who love him. You could still get a similar meaning with the Spirit as the subject. That's what Robert Jewett suggests in his commentary. This seems to be the line taken by the NEB and the REB, and in everything, he, the Spirit, cooperates for good with those who love God. But I prefer the suggestion in the NEB margin. This is close to what is now proposed by Jacob and by Kismet and Walsh. God himself cooperates for good with those who love God. This is anticipated in the RSV's "In everything God works for good with those who love him." It is suggested as a second alternative in the margin of the NIV. In all things God works together with those who love him to bring about what is good. The Spirit, as in verses 16, 26, and 27, is the one at work within believers. And this Spirit and believer combination is the joint unit with which the Father is cooperating. The very moment of the wordless lament described in verse 26 is the moment when God the Father and God the Spirit are working together, with believers caught up by the Spirit within that strange but vital interchange. So the encouragement and comfort here in Romans 8:28 doesn't amount to a kind of stoic resignation. It is a call to recognize the truth. It is a call to recognize the truth of what Paul says elsewhere, that we are called to hard work, knowing that God is at work in us. That work, it seems, takes place not least through suffering with the Messiah in order to share his image-bearing human glory. When Paul speaks here of believers as those who love God, he seems to be reflecting the heart-to-heart communication consisting of a lament too deep for words, which he has just described. The last phrase of the verse, "who are called according to his purpose," then seems to be describing not God's purpose for those people, that he would give them final salvation, but his purpose through these people. God has called them to be part of his saving purpose for his suffering world. Believers at this point may not have words to speak their lament, but they may still have work to do in healing, teaching, poor relief, campaigning, and comforting. These things grow out of lament. As with the church in Antioch, we may not be able to say why, but we may glimpse what. Who is at risk? What can be done? Who shall we send? Ironically, it has been easy in some traditions to reverse this, to be afraid of adding works lest one might compromise grace and faith, but to be only too ready to add explanatory words where, as Paul insists, even the Spirit remains inarticulate. Paul is not then proposing a Christian version of Stoicism. He is offering a Jesus-shaped picture of a suffering, redemptive providence in which God's people are themselves not simply spectators, not simply beneficiaries, but active participants. They are called according to his purpose, since God is even now using their groaning at the heart of the world's pain, as the vehicle for the Spirit's own work, holding that sorrow before the Father, creating a context for the multiple works of healing and hope. Such God lovers are therefore shaped according to the pattern of the Son, the cruciform pattern in which God's justice and mercy, God's faithfulness to the covenant and to creation are displayed before the world in tears and toil, lament and labor. That is our vocation in the present time. So the next chapter is, where do we go from here? Why must we lament? And we will take that chapter up next week. Thank you for listening and have a great day.